All right, here we go. Hello, hello, hello. I am John Beckman, Professor John Beckman, Dr. John Beckman, the father of sin, transgenic mother of sin, your hostess with the mostest, coming to you live from Southern Command with half my brain tied behind my back. Just make it fair. So today I want to talk about the paper that was just finally, after years in peer review, accepted. Computer numerical control knitting of high resolution mosquito bite blocking textiles, or as I like to call it, mosquito bite blocking textiles. I think this is the best paper of my entire career, being completely honest. This is 5 to 6 years worth of work, a ton of pain, stress, management, problem solving, hardest thing I've ever worked on in my entire career. And it's finally out. So this is a practice talk. I have to give this lecture at The Ohio State University in 2 weeks. So this is a practice lecture for that lecture. So I'm John Beckman, Assistant Professor of Medical Veterinary Entomology and Biotechnology. So I study mosquitoes, bugs, and the diseases that they spread. And I try to invent solutions that stop mosquitoes and other insects, biting insects, from spreading diseases. I also have a YouTube channel. I'll be posting this on my YouTube channel at Prof. Beckman. Okay, so this is the paper. We finally did get it accepted. It's in a Nature brand journal, not Nature, but within the Nature brand, and a subsidiary journal called Communications Engineering. I think we kind of got screwed in the peer review of this. We actually sent it in to Nature, and we actually got really good feedback from the main editor at Nature. This was the feedback. I made a comic about it. It says, "Ding, your paper was rejected. We don't have any criticisms. We actually like what you're doing a lot." That's what the Nature editor told us. So the Nature editor at Nature at the top said, "We don't have any criticisms. We really like what you're doing." But then they would not review it. So then they sent it down to the lower tier journals. We tried to send it to my first, then second round was Nature Biotechnology, because I think the biotechnologists need to read this. That's the audience that needs to read this paper, is the biotechnologists. They didn't want it there because it doesn't have as much biotechnology as they wanted. It's more of an engineering paper. So then we tried to go to Nature Communications. Nature Communications didn't want it. And then we finally got it accepted in an engineering journal within the Nature brand subsidiary, Communications Engineering. So it was kind of like this niche paper. Although, again, I think this is the most important paper I've ever written in my entire life. I think this will be the most impactful paper I've ever written, ever worked on, the most impactful project I've ever worked on in my entire life. So they should have taken it at Nature. Big mistake for them to not take it. I sent it to Science and they laughed at us. So at least Nature was reasonable enough to review it within the system. Although, again, we had just a ton of drama with the peer review on this paper that I can talk about. Now that it's been published, it actually got highlighted. So it says highlighted in a research highlight for Nature brand. It says, "Plagued by mosquitoes, try some bite blocking fabrics." And here's that article. Okay, again, before I go into it, sorry for the large preamble, but I do have to thank the Alabama Department of Economic and Community Affairs, ADECA, which funded the research here. This was a very unique grant that is funding research projects that are going to create products for the state of Alabama to sell to improve its economy. And this is definitely that. We're finally at the point where we are about to begin selling these products. So I just want to thank the state of Alabama for providing this funding. I could have never gotten funding for this under NIH. They would have never, ever looked at this. They would have completely laughed. So I want to thank the state of Alabama for providing research to research funds to a very unique idea that could never, ever have been funded from a federal agency. All right, let's give the context of this. The context is obviously mosquitoes. So here are some figures of malaria on the left, dengue on the right, where cases of these diseases are popping up. Malaria is still worldwide. It's still endemic in 85 countries. About 500,000 people die each year of malaria, and most of those are children. So if you want to stop malaria, it's a good deed, good karma. You're helping kids. Here's a map of dengue cases. So mosquitoes can not only spread parasites like Plasmodium that causes malaria, but they can also spread many scary viruses like dengue fever. And dengue fever can kill people. Okay, so here's all the outbreaks or the incidence cases of dengue. You can see in the United States, we don't have a very large problem of it, but as these insects come up north, sometimes we do get sporadic cases of dengue. So the point here is this just goes to show that mosquitoes are still a global burden on many populations and many people. They cause irreparable damage. They kill people. Mosquitoes are the largest killer in terms of animals, of humans. So the mosquito is the animal that kills the most humans every year. That's how deadly it is. And there are various ways that humans in the past have dealt with mosquitoes. Okay, so how to solve this problem? One, you can have what's called vector control. So vector control is just killing the mosquitoes. Okay, we use insecticides to effectively kill mosquitoes, although a lot of people don't like the chemicals. A lot of people don't like negative environmental impacts of insecticides, and there are off-target effects from insecticides where you might spray for some mosquitoes, but then you end up killing the honeybees. Okay, so there's lots of negatives to using blanket use insecticides. Another strategy is water removal. So mosquitoes are obviously aquatic and they breed and they lay their eggs and their larvae and their pupae grow in the water. So if you remove the water, you remove their breeding grounds. So historically, many people treated for mosquito-borne diseases by removing water around them. Now, this becomes a lot more difficult if you're dealing with something like a city. In a city, it's much more difficult to remove all the water sources because mosquitoes can breed in things like tires or open containers. So you can't go to every apartment building and go to everybody's flower plant and remove their tiny cup of water. It's unfeasible. So it's very difficult to do the removal strategy, water removal strategy in things like cities. And cities are where you have these outbreaks of vector-borne, mosquito-borne diseases. That can get pretty bad. Another way that people are trying to deal with this is through transgenic mosquito biotechnology. This is not a lecture on that. I'm not going to go into that, although I do have many lectures on that in my medical veterinary entomology playlist. All I'll say is that the biotechnologists really should read this paper, because what this paper points out is that there are some very, very obvious things that mosquito researchers should have done and never did for hundreds of years. And so rather than resorting to genetic biotechnology solutions, which we don't know all the negative impacts of, it might be worthwhile to try some very simple solutions like this paper pitches. For example, making better clothing that blocks mosquito bites. Okay, I would really like to highlight this. I really literally found an absurdity in my field. We haven't solved the most basic protection problems. So let me start by asking a question. Have you ever been bitten through your clothing? Have you ever been bitten by a mosquito outside through your clothing? I have many, many times. Upper back. Sometimes I'll go out in my shorts and I'm wearing socks, and bizarrely, the mosquitoes will bite me through the sock at my ankle rather than going to the open skin. So mosquitoes don't have any problem biting through textiles. And many people who work outside know this. So the absurdity here is that many people are trying to think of all these kind of out there solutions to vector-borne disease, creating these biotech transgenic systems to stop mosquitoes from spreading diseases. And yet we haven't even engineered our own clothing to block mosquito bites. I think that's absurd. And so that's one reason why I dedicated the last 5 to 6 years of my life trying to fix this problem. Another question that cannot be answered is how many cases of the diseases listed above, like malaria and dengue, how many of those diseases are transmitted through bites in the open skin versus bites on the clothing? So nobody can actually, you can't quantify this, right? This is sort of a interesting question that can never be quantified, because you can't precisely measure or map which bite gave somebody malaria. You just end up with a patient in the hospital who has malaria. You just end up with a patient in the hospital who has dengue. You can't actually trace back and figure out which mosquito actually transmitted malaria if somebody has multiple bites. So imagine somebody comes in, they have multiple mosquito bites. When did they get malaria? Which bite was the one that gave them malaria? Who knows? That's not something you can track unless they came in with like one bite. And there are no studies that say, like, when somebody comes in with malaria or dengue, there isn't a single study that I have ever seen that says some percentage of these disease transmission bites happened at this particular part of the body. Does that make sense? So it's not something that you can map. So I posit the question, how much disease can we prevent by engineering better clothing? Okay, so when we first pitched this idea, a common thing that most people say or might think is, well, for example, if you just make a t-shirt bite blocking, is that going to stop malaria? And the question is, I don't actually know. because you can't measure that, because you don't know what percentage of malaria cases are transmitted in the open skin in the arms or through a shirt or a sock in the back or at the ankle. You can't actually measure that. So the question of how much disease would be prevented by engineering better clothing is we don't know. But my argument is that it's greater than zero. It's greater than zero. Okay. And if you actually map out where mosquitoes bite, so this is some of the first data I'll show from this paper. We did this experiment where we had a set amount of mosquitoes in a cage. I stepped in the cage. We had an observer in the front, an observer in the back, and they just mapped out how many landing events we had when a mosquito would land and try to bite. Okay, me in the cage. And this is the bite map. This is a bite map for Aedes aegypti. So Aedes aegypti is a black and white mosquito that transmits many viruses: yellow fever, dengue, Zika, etc. And what you'll notice is that the mosquitoes like to go to the upper back and they like to go to the ankles primordially. So what's very interesting is that the parts of the body that are not covered by textiles, so if you're wearing a t-shirt, your arms, your hands, or your legs, if you're wearing short shorts, those are actually not the areas that are most attractive to the mosquitoes. So again, like wearing a t-shirt, what do I want to say? Is that the areas that are most commonly exposed to open skin are not actually the areas that mosquitoes are primarily most interested in. Okay, mosquitoes are most interested in the upper back and the ankles, which are often covered by socks and shoes and a t-shirt. Okay, so again, the importance of this is that my argument is that many of the bites that transmit diseases are probably happening in the upper back through a textile and in the ankles through a sock. So this is something that we could easily fix by re-engineering clothing to block mosquito bites. Okay, so again, one big thing, the one big absurdity is that people don't understand this is a huge problem that could prevent disease. I don't precisely know how much disease it would present, but it would be greater than zero. Maybe it'd be 50%. Maybe 50% of all mosquito-borne diseases could be prevented by re-engineering clothing to block mosquito bites. Okay, that's how important this problem is. Okay, so take a look at this. These are 10 different textiles that are common things that people wear. So A, B, C, and D are what are called knits, which I will define later. And F, G, H, I, and J are what are called weaves, which I will define later. Now look at these in the microscope. These are microscopic images of these textiles. Look at these, and what you'll notice is in every single textile, there are holes, okay, in the textile. Whether it's a weave or a knit, every single textile has holes. And these holes are small enough that a mosquito can bite through these very easily. And it's very easy for the mosquito to find and immediately find these holes. A mosquito lands and it will probe 3 to 4 times, and it will, within the first 5 seconds, immediately find an opening in the textile. And I have a video of this. Just for interesting tidbits, C, this right here, this is Under Armour. D, this is rhino skin, which is actually advertised as a mosquito bite blocker. And when you look at it, you can see it's laced with holes. This is a protective horse mesh, okay, which has gigantic holes. And these weaves are dress shirts or other weave patterns. This is twill. This is what makes jeans. Then you have poplin, Royal Oxford, Oxford, and pinpoint Oxford. So various sort of like dress shirt configurations of weaves. If you look at these in the microscope, they all have holes. None of these block. Okay. So we actually did some experiments on whether or not these would block. These are some of the first important experiments. Like, let's test a bunch of clothing that normal people wear, and let's see what percentage of clothing will block mosquito bites. Okay. So the way that you set up this experiment, I have here another cartoon. So we take 20 female mosquitoes, we starve them, we put them in a cage so that they're hungry, ready to feast. And we put the textile around an arm. We put a glove on our hand just so we don't get bit on the hand. So essentially the surface area is your arm covered by a tight textile, okay? And we put your arm in a cage and we quantify how many bites you get in a cage full of 20 mosquitoes for 15 minutes. So the important thing about this experiment is that it's 15 minutes. It's a very long duration experiment where you're literally just sitting there. Okay. So the mosquitoes are going to have hundreds, if not thousands, of probing attempts in the cage. Okay. So this is really a rigorous test. If you're going to find blocking, the 15 minutes is a rigorous time point. Okay. It's not like a quick test. We're sitting there and we're giving them infinite time to be able to bite us. Okay. D, these are the results of those experiments. So here is a negative control, which is just a blank arm, empty arm with no sleeve on it in a cage with 20 mosquitoes. Okay. And the mean is about 16 bites. So you put your arm in a cage full of 20 mosquitoes, you'll probably get about 16 bites. That's the mean. Some mosquitoes aren't hungry enough. They just kind of sit. Other mosquitoes are very aggressive. Okay. So you'll get about 16 bites. So everything needs to be compared against this sort of control. Anything significantly below that control, we would consider blocking. So we tested all the weaves. Okay. That's these with the holes. Obviously, none of those block. Okay. We tested some different knits. And what we discovered with the knits is most of the knits did not block, but there were some knits that were able to block a little bit. Not perfectly, but there were some knits that we found that were able to provide some protection. Okay. So one of the most important findings was that jeggings will block mosquito bites. So jeggings are a knitted jean with spandex, and they will provide you some protection. Again, importantly, Under Armour does not block. Rhino Skin, which advertises a blocker, does not block. Nike socks do not block. And the horse mesh, which advertises as a blocker, does not block. So the main take home here is that most clothing does not provide any protection whatsoever. None. Mosquitoes have no problem immediately just biting through clothing. Here's another really interesting experiment. Okay, this is E. What we have here in this experiment is we have a blinded person. So we put a blindfold on their face. Okay, we put their arm in a cage of a mosquito, and we have observers. Okay, and the observers watch when that mosquito will land on that person's arm. And the person who's blindfolded, what they have to try to guess or feel is they have to guess if they can, or tell if they can feel when the mosquito lands. So they have to see if they can perceive or detect a landing event of the mosquito. Okay. So can they feel the mosquito landing on them? Okay. So in the negative control with just 3 different people, so these are 3 different people doing this blindfolded experiment where they put their arm in the cage and they try to see if they can feel when the mosquito lands. Okay. This is on the y-axis percent landings detected. So their accuracy rate of detecting landings is about 50%. Okay. For a most sensitive individual, or maybe 35% for a less sensitive individual. Okay. This is with a bare arm. So essentially what this suggests is the hair on your arm is a good mechanism to be able to detect when insects land on your arm. And this is a very useful mechanism because then you can swat or move your arm, right, to get rid of the pest. On the other hand, if you are wearing tight form-fitting clothing like Under Armour, if you're wearing Under Armour, so this is a compression heat gear test where it's a spandex coating of a normal textile around the arm, they are no longer able to detect the mosquito landing on the arm. So if you're wearing Under Armour, you can no longer feel when a mosquito lands on you, and the mosquito has no problem biting through that. Okay, so you have made it even worse for yourself as opposed to just going completely naked because you cannot feel the mosquito landing on you anymore, and so you won't perceive the bite. Okay, so this is a very interesting result. What this result says is it's actually better to be completely naked than it is to wear form-fitting Under Armour clothing in a mosquito dense environment. And that sounds absurd, but that's what the data suggests. Okay. If you don't believe me that mosquitoes can bite through clothing, I do have a video. Take a look at this video. So here in this video, I have Under Armour versus a blocking knit. So I'm comparing what it's like for a mosquito to bite through Under Armour on an arm versus what it's like for a mosquito to bite through a blocking knit that we have engineered. So on the left, you have Under Armour. Look at the mosquito. It's probably, it's already through. It's already through, and you can see the holes. I have it here as like a comic. I am feeding. It's already feeding. Let me just redo that because it was instant. Okay. Start. It's feeding. So it probed essentially twice, and it immediately found a hole. Whereas on the right side, this mosquito is probing, and this is actually at 3x the speed, so it's you're seeing more time duration. It's probing, and it cannot find a spot. And so it keeps probing. It keeps walking around, probing, looking for a spot, but it cannot find a spot to bite through. Okay, so the main point of this video is just, in case you didn't believe me, here's a video of a mosquito landing on Under Armour, immediately biting, compared to a bite blocking net. Okay, just to prove to you that A, they can bite through most clothing. B, we can invent a knit that will block. Okay, so let's now think about, hopefully you're on my side now that you see with your own eyes that mosquitoes can bite through most clothing. Let's keep thinking about this question of how many cases of disease are transmitted through bites in the open skin or bites through the clothing. So how much percentage of disease is transmitted through bites through clothing? So what we did here in F, we took some of these, the most common garments that people wear. This is a short sleeve shirt, front and back, long sleeve shirt, front and back, shorts, pants, short sleeve, long sleeve, tight, form-fitting, long sleeve, dress, short shorts, capris, pants, female pants, and female leggings. So I actually walked around the town and I took tallies of what people were wearing, and I found the most common garments. And these are the most common garments for men and women. So short sleeve, long sleeve, shorts, pants, shorts, long sleeve, tight, long sleeve, dresses, short shorts, capris, pants, and female leggings. And what I did is I took pictures of models wearing these clothing, and I mapped in the red where the textile was clinging to the skin. Okay. So what you'll notice about short sleeve shirts is, again, they cling to the skin in the upper back. So in your upper back, your shirt is skin tight. And that's where mosquitoes can go and bite. And that's where they like. And if you look at this, actually the short sleeve does not actually provide much more protection than the long sleeve, because the mosquitoes are not really that interested in going into the arms. They're much more interested in going to the upper back. And the upper back is essentially completely exposed in either case. So essentially the point of F is that no matter what you're wearing, you can be bitten, because there's places where the textile clings to the skin. Even if you're wearing loose clothing, there's still parts of that loose clothing that cling to the skin. And mosquitoes are so persistent, they will find that spot that's clinging to your skin, and they'll bite you through your textile, no matter what you're wearing. That's the point of F. So when we actually submitted this, they said this was sexist. They said this data was sexist. I tried to argue for it. What I said was, like, in order for you to actually understand this argument, you need to actually see clothing and how it fits on people's bodies. So the models are necessary to understand the argument that we're trying to make. They thought that was sexist. And so eventually we had to revise the figure. So we had to take those pieces of it. This is the most bizarre thing I've ever had to do for a scientific paper. We had to take those pixels and transfer the pixels onto an anatomical model of male and female for the different garments, so that we could defeat the accusation that the actual data, the real data, was sexist. So here's a very interesting example of scientists actually, their real data being censored and having to be manipulated as required by the journal in kind of a bizarre way. Probably the most bizarre thing I've ever had to deal with in a paper. Anyway, let's not get sidetracked. So let's actually think about how we would solve this problem. And to understand how we might solve this problem of mosquitoes being able to bite through clothing, especially where it clings to the skin, you have to have an understanding of the mosquito proboscis. Okay, so here's an Aedes aegypti head, and I'm showing you here the dimensions. So the length of the proboscis is about 2 millimeters. And I'll point out the particular parts that are pertinent. So the mosquito has what's called a labium. Okay, that's what's marked in the gray. The labium actually retracts and exposes the needle. So when you actually look at the mouth part of a mosquito, most of what you're seeing is the labium, which is this outer sheath, this fat sheath that gets pulled back to expose what are called the stylets. And the stylets are what are shown in B, are these microneedles, okay? And they have different functions. So the labrum which is here, which is this black thing, or here, which is a tube, okay? It's 25 micrometers thick in diameter. And this is the tube that actually the mosquito stabs into you and sucks up blood through. So the blood gets sucked up through the labrum. Now, apart from the labrum, there's what's called the hypopharynx, which is marked right here. The hypopharynx is the saliva tube where the mosquito spits into you. So there's two separate tubes where the mosquito spits into you and sucks up the blood. That's the labrum and the hypopharynx. Then there are two blades, which are called the mandibular stylets and the maxillary stylets. And the maxillary stylets are special because they're serrated. So here I have shown you the serrations, and here I have shown the serrations. And what actually happens is when the mosquito is biting you, so it pulls back the labium, retracts the labium, exposes these blades, and then the maxillary stylets start sawing at a frequency that decreases the pressure required to penetrate the skin, okay? And so it uses these microstylets, which are held together by liquid surface tension, to pierce the skin. And this entire apparatus is controlled by very delicate muscles, and they can bend, and they can curve, and they can sense, and they find a capillary that they can tap into, and then they suck up blood through the labrum. So the main point of this is that the mosquito's proboscis, 2 millimeters, is long enough that it can go through most clothing very, very easily. And it's fine enough that if it just finds a hole, it can easily navigate that trajectory and then get into your skin and then navigate that trajectory to find a capillary. Very easy and very well evolved to blood feed. So we point all this out, and I teach you this biology just so that you understand it's actually difficult to block this, okay? It's difficult to block in that they can bend, so you can't, it's not easy to create a geometry that can just easily be blocking. And it's so small that it's very difficult to mass manufacture clothing that does not have holes for the mosquito to bite through. And you can think about this in another way. If you try to mass manufacture clothing without holes, it will not be very comfortable. So you have a double-edged paradox where, okay, we know the problem is we need to close the holes. But if we close all the holes, like latex or leather, the clothing will not be breathable, and so it will not be comfortable to wear. So it's a very difficult engineering problem that we face, is how do you make comfortable mosquito bite blocking clothing that you can mass manufacture that stops these holes, which are tiny, but yet is also comfortable. Okay, and the solution we came to was knitting. So here's a picture of some knitting needles. I'll come back to this. Let's address this question of how is clothing actually mass manufactured? So there's two main processes that produce clothing that people wear. Okay, so there's weaving and knitting. And here you can see the different conceptual schemes of weaving versus knitting. So weaving is when you have more than one fiber. You usually have a fiber going left and right, that's the weft, and you usually have a fiber going up and down, that's the warp, and you go over, under, or in some different intricate pattern to create some weave, okay? So think over, under, different fibers, that's weaving. Knitting is a different process where you use one fiber. It's a very unique invention where you can take one fiber and you can, through knots or loops, you can do recursive looping loops through loops to create rows of loops, which are called courses, that come together to form columns of loops, whales, okay? So key differences is that knitting is recursive looping and looping, loop the loop, with one fiber. And knitting is known to actually be more comfortable. It produces more comfortable fabrics, more flexible fabrics, and tighter compressing fabrics, okay? So when you look back to our earlier data, it's no surprise that we did find some knits that will block mosquito bites with some level of efficacy, though not 100%. Okay, so the next thing you need to know about knitting manufacturing. So we discovered that we were interested in knitting. So we want to deviate from weaves and go hardcore into the knits. So when you deep dive into knitting, you will learn that there are what are called knit diagrams. Okay, so here's the most simple knit diagram. Knit diagram is a symbol diagram that is showing you the code to produce the geometric structure of the knit you want to make. Okay, and these are literally codes. One of our collaborators, Jim McCann at Carnegie Mellon actually writes simulations where we can simulate the geometries of these knit diagrams. Okay, so the process of constructing a knit, which might involve various techniques like a front knit or a back knit or a tuck or a skip, these are the symbols for those actions, in addition to a needle symbol and a transfer, which is when a loop is passed from one bed of needles to another bed of needles. So you can also pass loops around and pull them to different areas. Okay, all these symbols can come together to guide a machine to create a knitted textile. Okay, so that is what's called CNC knitting, computer numerical control knitting. So that CNC knitting machines can intake code, computer code, and they can output robotic movements in the robots that mass manufacture knits. Okay, so there's two main types of knitting machines: there's circular knitting machines and flatbed knitting machines. For this project, we went with the flatbed knitting machine because we knew we wanted a machine where we could try a bunch of different settings, try a bunch of different geometries very quickly. So the flatbed knit machine, here the one we bought is a Stoll ADF. So here's the actual flatbed knitting machine that we bought. Okay, this was good for prototyping and testing knits. And we could rapidly change the diagrams and we could rapidly produce different prototypes. Here's what it looks like. What it actually is two beds of needles. So there's a front bed and a back bed. And if you zoom in, these are what the needles look like. Okay, they're very, very, very fine. And there's rows of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these needles. Okay, and through simple up-down movements and left and right movements, they can create these complex knitted geometries. Here's how the needles actually move. Okay, so if you can envision this, the first step, this is a special needle. This is called a bearded needle. The needle has this little hook that is on a hinge. So that's a bearded needle. And the first step is for the needle, which is already inside of a loop, to go up. Okay, so it goes up and there's a string hanging at the top from what's called a yarn carrier. And the hook goes above the string. And then the next step is it comes down. Okay, so that's this one, comes down and it pulls that loop such that as it goes down, the beard comes up and closes the loop around, or the needle around the loop, and pulls it through the other loop. So these are actually the 4 action steps that give you a loop through a loop. And then you can, from there, if you can understand this, you can understand that just from simple up-down movements and left and right, you can knit very complex patterns. Now I say this and I make it seem really easy. It's actually extremely difficult. The machine breaks all the time. The needles break all the time and constantly need to be repaired. The yarn breaks all the time. So there are all these different contraptions designed to hold the yarn at the perfect tension so that it doesn't snap, but it yet has enough give that you can actually pull things and create a structure. So there's a lot of complicated engineering here. If you're very interested in that, I actually have a knitting playlist on YouTube. Insects in general can cause lots of problems to humans. Mosquitoes in particular. Mosquitoes kill about 750,000 people every year from spreading diseases to them. So here's our knitting playlist. If you're interested in going deep dive into machine knitting, you can start at this playlist. We certainly do not cover all the things that you can do, but we try to cover the basics to establish a routine protocol for the knit lab so that I could go back and use these protocols. So these are open for everybody if you're interested in machine knitting. Freely available on YouTube. One of the reasons that I say that this is the hardest thing I've ever worked on is because of this machine. The machine, again, if you're doing new things, so most of these machines are designed for mass manufacturing. So they're designed for an initial optimization phase and then constant production of the same thing. Whereas what we want to do in the research lab is not that. What we want to do in the research lab is we want to make one copy of something new, and then we want to immediately change everything to make another copy of something completely new, prototyping. And so prototyping with these machines is, I just said it was easy, but it's very difficult. Just because constantly things are breaking, and this is a very expensive machine, and everybody's afraid to use it. Nobody wants to be breaking the $150,000 machine, etc. It makes research difficult. So I have some of these comics dealing with that issue. Okay, but the point of all this is some of the very early preliminary data suggested that the knits were blocking, and we wanted to start doing research on how those knits were mass manufactured. So we got the Stoll ADF flatbed knitting machine, and then we started prototyping our own knits to see if we could figure out how to make mosquito bite blocking textiles. So the next question, obviously, then is what textile configurations naturally block with a control yarn? Okay, so the next experimental setup. What we did is we took one control yarn that was non-flexible. So this is a polyester yarn, not a lot of give, not a lot of stretch, not like spandex. Okay. And what we wanted to see is if we make a whole bunch of different knits with the same yarn, are there some that will block and some that won't? And if there are some that will block, that suggests that there's something about that geometry that blocks rather than the fiber configuration. So we controlled all the other parameters, including the yarn, and knitted a bunch of different patterns, okay? So the patterns that we knitted are single jersey, which is the most common, tubular, alternate jersey, interlock, jersey skip, full rib, full cardigan, and half cardigan with a natural polyester, I guess it's not natural, it's synthetic, with a polyester control yarn. So here are the knit diagrams, here are the actual structures. And obviously what we discovered and what everybody knows about textiles is that textiles often shrink, right? Especially polyester, okay? So one of the factors that we included in these experiments are before and after washing and heat treatments. So with this interlock knit, we're actually demonstrating for you how much this thing shrinks. So you see here, there's this intercolumn space. This is before you wash. And then here, this is after you wash, that space shrinks up. So obviously this is something we like if we're trying to get mosquito bite blocking textiles, okay? And here we're quantifying how much of the shrinkage is happening. So the shrinkage was a good thing. We liked that. So then we treated and we tested all of our knits with the heat treatment, the single wash dry cycle on a hot cycle to shrink the knits. So it's sort of a standard process where we would produce these knits with a control yarn. We'd wash them, we'd dry them on a hot cycle so that they would shrink up, and then we would test. There are two things that we noticed. First thing we noticed is that most of the knits did not block. So most of the knits failed. Okay, so look at this. Here's the bare arm. Here's about the 16 bites control, okay? And most of the knits, again, provided no protection, almost actually worse than the bare arm. So most of these failed. But there was one that succeeded, which was the interlock, okay? After the wash. So amongst all the knits, this interlock, this is the only one that blocked. And that's this one in the data. And it only blocked after we washed it, okay? And that's why we started washing everything, okay? So key take homes, some knits do block, most don't. There is one geometry that naturally seems to block, which is called interlock. So you might wonder, well, what's special about the interlock knit? If you look at the interlock knit diagram, what happens is that loops get positioned behind another loop. So there's sort of like loops that overlap onto another loop. And so if you look through these, if you're able to look through, this is actually not a hole right here. If you go through, you actually hit another loop on the other side. So interlock specifically kind of takes a loop and puts it on top of another loop to create a nice geometry that blocks mosquito bites. So there's something special about the interlock knit. So then we got really excited about the interlock knit, and we also got really excited about the question of, can we take some of these other knits that are not blocking, and can we make them blockers? Because we had discovered that washing and drying and shrinking can take something that's not blocking and make it a blocker. So then the question is, can we take some of these other ones and give them some kind of a treatment that will make them blockers? Okay, so then the next question is obviously, how can we engineer bite blocking, and what are the parameters of that bite blocking? So then we started to test individual parameters with some of these different knits. Okay, so here is a single jersey knit. And what we were testing here in A is increasing fiber diameter. So taking thicker and thicker fiber. So here is a thin fiber single jersey. Here's an intermediate fiber single jersey, and here's a fat fiber single jersey. And the fat fiber kind of has some tuft to it. And you'll notice, this is the bite data, as the diameter of the fiber increases, it seems to be filling up these gaps. You can visually see that. And the blocking correspondingly goes down, okay? So you can, one thing that you can do as one parameter to increase blocking is sometimes you can increase fiber diameter. So that's one parameter. All right, a next parameter we wanted to test was spandex, because spandex obviously makes comfortable clothing and it will shrink them up, right? So here we're testing some different configurations of the same knit jersey skip with different spandex contents. So we tested a 0%, a 2.7%, and a 3% spandex yarn. Okay. And as you increase the spandex, actually the geometry in the structure of the knit changes, because as you increase the spandex, you're putting more compressive forces, and that actually contorts the geometry of the knit. So the geometry of the knit actually changes as you increase the spandex. And correspondingly, if you put more and more spandex in at about 3%, the blocking goes down. So one parameter is to increase spandex content, and that will give you better blocking. Okay, the final thing we tested was stitch length. So stitch length is a parameter in the actual machine. When the loop is pulled down, the question is, how far is it pulled down? What's the distance? That's the stitch length, okay? And if you decrease the stitch length, you get tighter and tighter knits, okay? So here's 11 stitch length, 10 stitch length, and 9 stitch length interlock. And as you decrease the stitch length, you make it tighter and tighter and tighter, and the blocking goes down and down and down, almost perfect, okay? The downside of this is that as you increase the stitch length, the fiber gets tighter, and it's not as comfortable, and it's not as stretchy. That's the downside. Okay, so the take-homes of this data are that there are 3 parameters, probably more, but we identified 3 key things that you can control that can help change something that's not blocking into a blocker. 1 is the fiber diameter, 2 is the increasing the spandex content, and 3 is decreasing the stitch length. Okay, this sounds obvious, but nobody had ever tested this. Nobody had ever figured this out. You can't find a single paper that describes this. Okay, so the next question that we had is, does it work for all mosquitoes? Okay, so we can't test all mosquitoes, but we did test another species. So here's Aedes aegypti. This is the one that we've been testing. And there is another mosquito that's an interesting mosquito called Psorophora. Psorophora you hear about all the time in Texas or in Florida when there's a big hurricane or a big flood. Often you hear or you'll see these popular science articles about these giant mosquitoes, okay? Giant swamp mosquitoes. These are the giant swamp mosquitoes, Psorophora. They're actually cannibalistic, so the larvae actually eat other mosquito larvae. It's kind of a bizarre thing. They're difficult to breed. We had to go out into the field to collect these, okay? So we tested whether or not our knits blocked both Aedes aegypti and Psorophora, and they do block both. And the other interesting thing about Psorophora is that it's got the largest proboscis. So one question we had was, well, maybe if it had a larger proboscis, maybe it could more effectively sort of like pierce, or maybe it could more effectively move with stronger musculature, move the fabrics so that it could pierce. And it was not able to do that. So one way we quantify this is with the number of probes. So if you just count how many times the mosquito tries to probe, on a bare arm, it's a very small number because it just immediately gets a blood meal. Whereas if you have a textile, it's often probing and probing and probing for the entire duration of the experiment, and it can't get through. So increased probes means it's blocking, okay? So here you see for Aedes aegypti, the textiles, this is Interlock is blocking. And here, this is the same experiment for Psorophora with a smaller N, again, because it's very difficult to get these mosquitoes. We had to field collect these to do these experiments. We had to field collect the larvae and then culture the larvae in the lab. And then we also have a secondary measure, which is just time probing, just another readout, but the results are the same. So if they can't get through, they probe more and more and more and more. And you can use that as a measure. Okay, so at this point, we have figured out how to make and engineer bite blocking clothing. The final question is, how can we make them more comfortable? So we actually had a fashion design student who was both biosystems engineering and fashion design. She was a fashion design undergraduate and also a biology undergraduate, and she was a biosystems engineering master's student. Okay, so we asked her to look into this comfort question. And one way of them measuring how they scientifically quantify comfort in the fashion field, it's kind of an interesting question. Like, how do you scientifically quantify comfort, which is subjective? And it is subjective. So you have to do these sort of like subjective like survey tests, okay? But there are references for this, and there are described ways to quantify comfort in the literature for textiles, okay? So there's 9 parameters: fuzziness, force to compress, fabric to fabric friction, grittiness, hand friction, noise intensity, which is like the sound, things that sound like windbreakers are perceived as less comfortable. Thickness, so thick things are not very comfortable. Tensile stretch, you want something that stretches. And stiffness. These are all subjective parameters that the textile field uses to perceive and subjectively quantify comfort. Okay, so understand that there is this sort of like 9-factor comfort test where you take a textile that is sort of like the edge cases. So, for example, for fuzzy, the way that these experiments work is you take something that's superbly fuzzy and comfortable, maybe something like a fleece, like a thick fleece fabric. Okay, that'd be very, very fuzzy and also very, very comfortable. In contrast to something like sandpaper, which would obviously be not comfortable. And you set up a scale range of 0 to 10, and you bring subjects in. Okay, you blindfold them, and you say, I want you to rank this textile on a scale of 0 to 10 in terms of fuzziness. Feel this first. Here's the comfortable fuzzy. This is your level 10. Feel this. Here's your sandpaper. This is the level 0. Now, how would you rank this textile in between 0 to 10? Okay, so it's subjective, and yet it's quantifiable. So if you do this for the 9 factors of comfort, you can get a summation of these factors, which is called the comfort score. Okay, so we ranked these comfort scores for these textiles, again, according to the textile literature. And what we were able to show, which is important, is that some of our blockers are not statistically different from the Under Armour control. So everybody perceives Under Armour as extremely comfortable. So that was sort of like our control for comfort. That's red here. And so the question is, can we get anything that's blocking also close to this Under Armour? And the answer in terms of comfort score is yes. So the jeggings were in proximity, and the Interlock was in proximity, although it was statistically less comfortable in terms of comfort score, although this is late now. So again, this paper has been in peer review for about 2 years. I've been trying to publish this paper for forever. And so now we're far beyond this. And we are at a point now where we have something that is equivalent in comfort to Under Armour that also blocks. But the point of this, when this paper was coming out, was that we can, in fact, produce mosquito bite blocking clothing that is not statistically significant, is not statistically different from something that's supremely comfortable like Under Armour. Okay, there are other ways to measure comfort, obviously, not just sort of like a subjective comfort. There's also heat gained. So things that are going to be very, very hot in hot weather are going to be extremely uncomfortable. So we can measure the change in degrees. Okay, so this is a very simple experiment where you measure the surface level temperature. You put on a textile, you take a before after, sitting in a room for a duration of a certain amount of time, and you can measure the change in temperature on the skin. Okay, and the point here is that here's our Under Armour control. Okay, this is the change in degrees Fahrenheit on the skin, and our blocking textiles are not statistically different from the Under Armour. And here is the cotton sweatshirt control, so something that is extremely hot, just a sort of like a negative control, so you can see where those data are. Okay, the final measurement of comfort that we relied on was air permeability. Okay, and you can measure air permeability by spraying air through a textile and measuring the distance or the force generated on an object on the other side. Okay, so that's essentially what we did. And again, what we're able to demonstrate is that in terms of air permeability, we can create textiles that are not significantly different from the Under Armour control. So in 3 separate comfort parameters, we can generate textiles that are equivalent in comfort. And so the main take-home is that bite blocking, there's no excuse to not do bite blocking clothing. Bite blocking, you can make bite blocking clothing that is equal in comfort to the other things that other people are wearing. So there's no reason not to create bite blocking garments on everything that humans wear. Final things to look at. I won't go into too much detail. We just created a 3-dimensional graph that shows you where these textiles are in terms of these 3 different parameters. This is an interesting experiment. We did detect whether or not mosquitoes prefer white or black. This has pretty much been a well-studied subject. Mosquitoes can detect color, and they do have color preferences. So then the question is, well, not only can you make bite blocking fabric, but you can also make fabric in the text in the color that will repel the mosquitoes. Okay, and so that double combination might make things better. So we just did a simple white-black test. They are much more attracted to black, very statistically significant than they are to white. So obviously our first generation shirts will be white. And then the final thing that happened to us is at Science, when we submitted this to Science, they rejected it for the most ridiculous, asinine thing, the editor said that you have no evidence that this would actually help malaria, or you would have no evidence that this would actually help prevent vector-borne disease, which to me, that's the most idiotic thing somebody could say, because if you're actually preventing mosquito bites, you're obviously preventing mosquito-borne disease. But in order to defeat that criticism, when we submitted to Nature, we created a SIR model, which is a susceptible, infected, recovered computer model that looks at how these textiles would impact something like a dengue outbreak. Okay. And essentially, everybody's sick of this, the flatten the curve thing. But essentially, what you can reproduce in the SIR model is an effect where if they're wearing the textiles, okay, you get a flattening of the curve. And so you reduce the cost on the healthcare system and you prevent explosive outbreaks of vector-borne disease if people are just wearing this textile. Okay. Final thing I'll show as an important control. This is a measure of the thickness of many of the textiles that we're working with, and all the thicknesses of these textiles is less than the length of the mosquito proboscis, which is 2 millimeters. So all these textiles are smaller than the width of the mosquito proboscis. So they're not occluding the mosquito because of the distance away from the skin. They're actually mechanically blocking the proboscis from getting through. And the final goal of this, as we move forward on engineering comfort, is to get as thin as possible to create something like Mithril from Lord of the Rings, which is the most finest interlocking knit geometry that we can make in the thinnest form that will block mosquito bites. All right, I will point out our very important and necessary collaborators. So Dr. Jim McCann at Carnegie Mellon University. Jim has been essential for helping us understand the different knit geometries, doing simulations of knit geometries, and understanding basic knitting. Jim was essentially a mentor to me to help me learn about the knitting process, and was a key researcher in this paper. The paper is a co-first authorship with two of my students, master students, Brian Holt and Kyle Oswald, Kyle is now a PhD student in my lab. And Brian works at a knitting company and is now helping us with our startup LLC. Michaela was the first undergraduate who I ever had work in my lab. Michaela was actually the one who discovered that jeggings block. So Michaela's job when we first started was to initially collect some of the test cells that we teched. And it was through her work that we actually discovered that female jeggings block mosquito bites. So one of the most important discoveries that we made was because of Michaela. Alexa was the master student working on the comfort aspects of this, co-mentored with Dr. Adhikari in biosystems engineering here at Auburn. And then we also have Bella and Rich helping out on this project. Rich was always my go-to guy for when the machine is not functioning. Rich is always the guy who can make it happen. Okay, so I'll thank the Alabama Department of Economic and Community Affairs for this life-changing grant. Again, I think this is the most important work I've ever done in my career, and I thank the state of Alabama for helping me do this research. And if you want to check out the paper, Computer Numerical Control Knitting of High-Resolution Mosquito Bite-Blocking Textiles, published now in Communications Engineering. Hope you enjoyed. Have a good day.
I shall meet death head on. Decade, you've got to get out of here. Beware foul demons and beasts. There are many foes here. The time has come to cleanse my homeland. This monastery reeks with evil and corruption. I hate staining my hands with the blood of foul sorcerers. Eternal suffering would be too great for you, Diablo. Let the gate be open to die. I shall meet death head on. I shall meet